So it's currently actually 3:30 in the morning. We're going to Roy's Peak for sunrise, and it's a real icon in the Wanaka area and in New Zealand, or even the world, to be honest. Me and Ryan have both wanted to climb it for years and years and years since starting photography. So we're getting up really early to hit it for sunrise to make sure it's, one, really quiet, we're hoping, and we're gonna get that perfect morning light. We've picked a good day, it's clear, bit of cloud cover, so we're gonna get some, hopefully, some burn in the sky. But all ambitions, we've got 3 hours hiking to do in the dark, so we're packing extremely light. So we've just spent the morning up on Roy's Peak above Lake Wanaka, and even though it was cloudless sunrise, it was absolutely gorgeous up here. I think it was everything that we'd both hoped to see. In terms of generating content, ideally you would find a high enough vantage point to where you could line up the silhouette of somebody on the iconic ridge line, usually against one of the surrounding fjords or in the bay below itself. But I use mostly 24 to 70 and ranged between 24 and 50 primarily. I wanted to incorporate some of my foreground elements. I know Alex was a little more into the compression shots, 70 to 200. I packed mine up here, but taking the lower road that we did, I didn't feel as though I needed to compress the scene quite as much. Alright guys, so we have just made our way back down Roy's Peak, and that was a very strenuous but one of the most rewarding hikes I've ever done in my life. Even though I'm a bit spent, I cannot wait to get to my images, and I think Alex feels the same way as well. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you my basic processing through Lightroom. It differs in a manner from the way that Alex processes his images, but I'm going to show you how I prefer to do mine. When I'm on the road, I usually condense my workflow, and I will immediately back up everything that I've shot while then selecting the images that I believe to be my favorite and most shareable, whether it's with a client or Instagram and Facebook, so on and so forth. So this image here immediately stood out to me. It has the depth of field that I was hoping to generate. Obviously Alex at that point on the ridge is just such a classic and iconic adventure shot that I knew that I wanted to share this with my audience immediately. So I'm going to process this image to be shared on Instagram. Once I've imported it to the Lightroom module, I will then go to the develop section, and this gives me the freedom to arrange the image any way I see fit. I usually take a quick look at the histogram. Here's the shadows, here's the exposure, and here's the highlights. Everything seems relatively balanced in this image to me except for the whites, which are extremely clipped. That may be an issue for some people in some images, but for me this was intentionally done in camera to generate this kind of dreamy, hazy, washed out sunrise effect. It reminds me of the feeling that I had with the sun on my face standing there shooting the photo, and it's something I generally hope to replicate when I am processing my images. So since this is for Instagram, I will come over to this checkered box here and I will click it, which gives me the ability to shrink, resize, or crop. What I will do is come into 4:5, which allows me to maximize the pixel count for this image in regards to social media. You can move it around up and down, and you can see how the histogram changes depending on which section of the image you've selected. I think I rather like this crop here. One thing I generally try to do, since Alex is my point of focus, I will click this and see where he is in regards to the center lines and the intersecting points. I know he's just fractionally right of center, so what I need to do is move this in, and that gives me a little more freedom to center him up and then begin to process my image from there. Once you're done with that, you click that, and this helps you avoid editing parts of the image that simply won't be there once it's exported. Now, moving into the basic sliders, I prefer to use the contrast slider, never too much, but I always push it up, 3, 4, or 5. It manages things different than colors. It's more about the shadows and highlights, and it creates an edge between the two. You can obviously over contrast your images, and that's a really basic mistake that I made when I was learning how to edit my photos. The same with the saturation slider. I see a little too heavy a hand on both of those, and I try to avoid going with that. But because I shoot raw in camera, my images are generally flatter than I'd like, and so I do have to manage the contrast in order to get the desired effect. The white balance looks good to me. I will push it a little more towards the yellow side. I'll warm the image to try to give the viewer the feel that the sunrise had given me when I was shooting. I will move down. I don't think I'm going to balance the highlights or shadows. I rather like where they are right now. I will push the whites up just a bit. Anywhere from 5 to 20 is where I generally operate with the whites. It's obviously predicated on the image, but for this one, I'm just going to go with the clipped whites in the sky and just let it have that look and general atmospheric haze that I think adds to this shot. Moving down to the clarity, vibrance, and saturation. For a dreamier effect, I will reduce clarity. For this image, I'm actually going to push it up 3 or 4, which is hardly noticeable unless you're pixel peeping. This is what pixel peeping is. When you zoom into an image and you scroll around and you can see individual parts of it. But for social media and for viewing on your phone, it's hardly an issue. Vibrance and saturation, once again, I'm shooting raw, so my images are flat. I'll push the vibrance up +2, push the saturation up 2. That helps me to keep a natural look while providing a little pop in my image. Moving down to the tone curve, you can obviously operate along this curve by setting points and pushing and pulling. I just use the sliders when I'm on the road. It's a lot easier for me. I'm going to push the lights up just ever so slightly. This is going to this is going to brighten this side down here and the sky while leaving this section of the image alone. So I don't have to balance the highlights and shadows. I can just go on the tone curve. Same thing, I'll drop the darks, -2 or 3. Hardly noticeable, but it does contribute to my overall aesthetic and style. One thing I do like to do is selectively saturate or provide a luminance to the image. Now I have a lot of orange and yellow in this image, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the orange up, I'm going to push the yellow up. You can see in this section here, I've reduced it back to 0, and watch. As I push it up, it helps pop that sunrise color, and I achieve this effect without oversaturating or doing anything that's unnecessary for a natural style edit. Moving down to the last couple things, I always sharpen my images in Lightroom. Some people say don't do it. There's a million rules and do's and don'ts. I personally push my I push the sharpening up around 50. It's never wrecked an image of mine, and I believe it helps create the desired effect when exporting my images from Lightroom. Noise reduction is not necessary. My ISO is at 100, which I generally try to shoot on, so there's no noise to reduce. Lens corrections, I always enable profile corrections. Do you see what happens? It stretches the image and it takes the vignette off the edges. When you shoot wide-angle lenses, or any lens for that matter, there's something called a parallax, and it can create distortion in your image, and this is the computer's best guess based on your lens profile to remove this from the image. And I think it's important. To each their own, but I do it every single time I process. The last thing I drop down and do, and this is not necessary, but I generally apply a mild vignette to each of my images. Once again, it's to create a unique look and aesthetic that is discernible to my style and my images. If nothing else, I prefer the way it looks, and when it comes to shooting and processing your photos, it's about what you want. It's not about what everybody else is going to like. So do your best to manage those hopes in regards to what everyone else hopes to see. So now that I've balanced and edited and cropped my image, what I'm going to do is come up here, I'm going to export. And since this is for Lightroom, we've set the image format to JPEG. If I were setting it to print, it would likely be a TIFF file, which is much bigger and has greater detail. There's just a lot more information in a TIFF or a file that's other than a compressed JPEG. I've never noticed an issue by pushing the quality to 100. I resized to fit the long edge for this vertical image here at 2020 pixels. Instagram will import a maximum of 2048, I believe it is, and so I set just below that, and my resolution is 72 pixels per inch. I sharpen for screen, the amount here is standard, and then I don't watermark my images unless they are going into a publication or for a reproducible, or a client that intends to reproduce them on a large scale. Aside from that, I will export this image. I've already done this once before, so I will overwrite, and then from here, that image is now in a folder. I'll open this image here, go to share, and I will airdrop this to my phone, and from there I have no loss of quality. It's an immediate transfer, and I'm ready to share my image via social media. It's a slightly different export and workflow for print, but aside from that, I believe I've showed you my most basic and effective form of editing.